Hello, my name is Kathleen and I'm back again with another historical sewing project. Today I will be talking about making my corset cover as part of my more long-term assembling of a complete set of late Victorian undergarments. This project was quite a bit simpler than a lot of the previous projects I've been working on recently. So honestly, it was a nice kind of breather, something simpler, a little more low-key. I drafted the pattern for this corset cover from the same book I drafted my combinations pattern, which is The Practical Designer for Women's and Misses' Underwear by Isidor Rosenfeld, published in 1881. This book had two different styles of corset cover patterns included in it, the normal style and the tight-fitting style. I decided to go with the looser style, let's be honest, partially out of laziness because it is a more forgiving garment in its fit, but also I had seen in my research a lot of corset covers of this style attributed to the Edwardian era, so the 1900s, even like a little bit into the 1910s, and I thought that having a garment that would also be appropriate for that era could be really, really useful if or when I want to dip my toe into Edwardian fashion a little bit. Not a whole lot of background here, but with that out of the way, let's jump right into construction. This corset cover has just 5 pieces, front, left, and right, back, and a flounce around the waist, which is cut in 2 pieces. I'm starting out by backstitching the side seams, shoulder seams, and center back seam of the flounce, finishing all of these by turning and felling. Next, I hemmed the neckline and arm size of the bodice, as well as 3 sides of the flounce, leaving the inside curved edge as is. Once all the pieces are prepped, I moved on to the front placket, turning the seam allowance under and then turning it under again to encase the raw edge and create a 1-inch wide facing for the buttons and buttonholes, securing it in place with a felling stitch. So making my corset cover had been going pretty smoothly so far, but we have just run into major issue number 1. So I had drafted the pattern for this project a while back, at the same time I was drafting the pattern for my combinations. So I had some notes and stuff on the pattern, but it's been long enough I forgot my exact thought process. So I had a note on the pattern to add 1 inch at the center front for the buttonhole facing. I had finished turning it in and sewing it down. I measured the waistline of the corset cover compared to the length of the ruffle, and the ruffle was exactly 2 inches too short. So I'm thinking that I either, one, had already added the inch at the center front when I was making the paper pattern and forgot that I had, or I misunderstood the instructions in Rosenfeld's book. It was saying that 1 inch had been added to the measurements for the facing instead of, once you've done this, add 1 inch. So either way, what I decided to do is I'd already felled down this, but I just basically turned it one more time, and I'm having to sew it down again. That's what I'm working on over here. So yeah, I took the already finished edge and just turned it under again. So it's a little more work, but in the grand scheme of things, a really easy fix. After that, it was time to pin the flounce in place and stitch it to the waist of the bodice with a back stitch. The waist of this corset cover is adjustable via a drawstring, so to create a casing for that tie, a ribbon in my case, I trimmed the seam allowances and attached a 1/2 inch wide piece of white bias tape along the waist seam with a running stitch. I then laced the ribbon through using the old safety pin trick. These stitches are slightly visible from the outside of the garment, and there is probably a way I could have incorporated this channel into the seam itself and made it completely invisible, but this was simple and lays nice and flat, and I'm perfectly happy with it. So this is super fun. My corset cover's technically finished except for buttons, and I tried it on with my corset, and there was just like a little small problem, like not a just something really just little trivial. It doesn't fit at all. When I drafted this pattern, I drafted it at the same time as my combinations pattern, and my combinations, because they go under my corset, used my uncorseted measurements, the same measurements I'd use for a modern pattern. Because I was making these two patterns at the same time, I just wasn't thinking, and I used the same measurements for my corset cover, which is worn over the corset. So needed to be the corseted measurements. And for the waist, this isn't a big deal because the difference isn't dramatic enough to really make a difference, especially because this has a drawstring waist. That's not the issue. It is the bust, because my corset does have bust padding. So the corset cover doesn't close. Just a little bit of a problem. Anyway, there's two things I could do to fix this. One would be, like I mentioned before, I turned this buttonhole facing over an extra time because, well, to meet the ruffle, so there's just like that. So I used just like really long, not sloppy, but really long felling stitches for that, so I could very easily just cut those stitches out, re-iron it. That would give me another about 2 inches, which I think would be just the right amount, and I'd be all good to go. But the ruffle would be too short, and I'm just worried that would look weird. My other option would be to start the whole thing over, which, though not ideal, I might actually end up doing, because this garment is relatively simple. It is 6 seams and a bunch of hemming. It's not that involved. Starting over would kind of be a bummer, because especially hand sewing, this is not a fast process. If I was at home and had my machine, I would just be like, yeah, call this a mock-up, and we're good to go. But since I am still hand sewing everything, it'd be really nice if I didn't have to do that. My plan right now is to start by unpicking this, so give that extra 2 inches how it originally was, try that on, see if the ruffle looks weird. If it looks fine and I'm like, it's fine, then I'm just going to go with that, not worry about it, move on. If it looks really weird and I just really don't like it, then I will go back to the drawing board, or technically the cutting table, if we're being specific. So good news on the corset cover. I unpicked that extra fold for the buttonhole facing, and with that and with the drawstring, it's a little bunchy right at the front, so I'm just going to need to remember to make the bottom button not quite at the bottom so it doesn't get all weird. But other than that, that really fixed the fit issues just fine. So turns out doing the pattern as instructed was what worked. Who'd have thunk? Looking at the corset cover, it is looking much more Edwardian in shape than late Victorian, and I was kind of wondering about that because, like I said earlier, this style of corset cover I've seen more referenced as an Edwardian, like 1900, 1903 sort of thing, as opposed to Victorian, but because this is a pattern straight from 1881, I'm just going to have to trust that people wore something like this in 1881 and that I'm doing fine. But it is, especially from the side, it is a much more Edwardian shape right now. But like I said, we will see where this takes us. With all of that sorted out, there's only a little bit left to do. I decided to leave my corset cover relatively undecorated, with the only extra bit being a ribbon threaded through some lace, matching the ones I used on my combinations, just right along the neckline. I decided to running stitch both the top and bottom edges of the lace to the fabric. This is something I learned from making my combinations. While not fragile, having the lace only sewn on one side makes it so I do have to be a little extra careful with the combinations. Last but not least, on go the buttons and buttonholes. With that, the corset cover is finished. This was a fun, easy project. It took me less than a week, but that was with hand sewing everything. If I'd had a machine, this probably could have been done in a day or two. Even with my mistake in terms of era, I should be able to make this garment work, at least until I can get around to making a more appropriately 1880s, 1890s corset cover. If nothing else, this can be a lesson for all of us. Always double check your sources, not just your notes. And hey, this gives me the tiniest head start for if and when I want to explore some Edwardian fashion. Anyway, that is all for this video. Thank you for joining me on this intended to be Victorian, ended up being Edwardian adventure. I hope you have a lovely day and happy sewing.